Folks, thank you very much for being here on this wild and windy evening. We have two incredible writers on the stage with us, and we're going to be talking over the next hour about how two books that don't at first glance seem to be made of the same materials can in fact show common themes between them. Both have a gripping immediacy to them, I think that's fair to say. And a real-time feel, a feel of things happening before your eyes. They're both acts of optimism and defiance at a time when we really need these things. I think they're both works that process inconceivable losses in their own ways as well. And they're both beautiful, they're both illuminating, and they're both wryly humorous as well. And I think they're both books about time, and the way that time moves, and the way that we respond to time, and the different shapes that time can take. So we are going to examine some of these things. There's going to be some time for questions at the end, questions, insults, marriage proposals, whatever you feel like. Go sick. There'll be a book signing upstairs with the two of them. I'd encourage you to get there and to meet both of them, because they're both incredible people. And we're also, the three of us are conscious that this is not just a festival for writers, but of writers too. So we're going to be talking a little bit about process, craft, and the toolkits that writers develop over time, because you can be sure that both of them will have some real nuggets to share on that front. So to kick us off, I would ask Caoilinn to maybe, can you give us a bit of a flavour of your novel, The Alternatives, the incredible cast of the quartet that you put together for it, and maybe how it came about?
Sure. Thank you so much, Hilary, and thank you to the festival. It's so lovely to be here. This has been on my horizon for a few years, and it was just such a joy to get an invite. Thanks for braving the weather. It's just a lovely thing. I wrote this book. It's about four sisters we meet them when they're all in their 30s. But their parents died when they were very young, so they really brought one another up. The eldest sister is a geologist, so we meet them, when they're all kind of heavily involved in their careers. When we meet her when she's in the opening pages, when she's lecturing in Galway, and she is trying to convey the collapse of deep time, where processes that should be taking place over millennia are happening over decades. And her other sisters, we meet all of them individually. We have Nell, who is a philosopher who's been adjuncting at various Connecticut universities for nearly 20 years. And she's been battling an illness that she can't afford to have diagnosed, and also contending with the commercialization of the academy. And then we have Maeve. They all have PhDs, I should say. So it's like, Sex in the City, except there's very little sex and it's mostly in the country, and they all have PhDs. So anyway, so Maeve, but her PhD is honorary. She's a kind of minor celebrity chef. She started collaborating with her sister on these videos. I won't go into it, but so she kind of accidented upon her career, but she has found herself dealing with the food shortage crisis in the UK, and with the hot-headed context of food nationalism. And then the fourth sister, Rona, is a political scientist, a celebrated tenured professor in Trinity, and she deals with direct democracy, particularly citizens' assemblies. And she is a single mum, and she's a complicated character. She's the one people have real feelings about. In the background, she's been paying untold sums to have seawall defences built to protect her shoreside mansion from ever fiercer storm surges. And so it's Alwyn, the eldest sister, the geologist, who initiates the novel, in that at the end of the first chapter, so it's not too much of a spoiler because it's in the opening of the book, she suddenly leaves her partner and his children and takes off on her bicycle in the middle of the night, leaving a note to her loved ones saying, "Don't try and find me." And the sisters have been living very different, distanced lives, and it's this moment that prompts them to come together for the first time in years.
It's an extraordinary cast of characters, and the way that you move between the voices is incredible. And at one stage, you move into the format of a stage play. as if you're trying to get these characters sort of on the same stage and talking to each other. It's quite a performance, I'd have to say.
I don't know if sometimes in big sibling families there can be an element of performance. Who's got the mic at any given time? Because there's just such a swell of voices. And one thing I became aware of when I was writing the book, that it's partly about family and about sisterhood, but it's also a book about women at work. Women expressing themselves through their professions and trying to do meaningful work, that gives them energy and anchorage and purpose. And I really liked the idea that they didn't need to be two separate novels, and to try and convey what it's like to be a woman in the world who is very invested in what you do. And simultaneously you're a sister. But somehow that only really comes into strong realization once you get closer and closer to family. And then your individual self collapses into nothing. And you can't even remember what you do for a living. You have no authority, and so I'm really interested in that. I keep on writing about adult siblings. And we are, I think, in the last generation of there being multiple siblings.
Yes.
Ireland, I think the fertility rate has gone down to something like 1.6. And I think you need to have it at around 2.1 to have a replacement rate. So, the idea of having multiple siblings is now, makes it a historical novel.
It's full of ideas, this book, and we're going to come back to those in a bit. But Liz, I'd like to invite you to tell people here about the extraordinary memoir that you've written, a book that is, I think, maybe the most extraordinary book that a non-fiction writer wishes that they never have to write. Could you please tell us about it?
Yes, thank you, and thank you to the festival, which has been so wonderful, and I'm very honoured to be here. It is the book I wish I'd never had to write. If you'd asked me as a novelist at any point in my career, what's the genre you would be least likely to write in, and I've hopped around the genres quite a bit, I would have said immediately memoir. I'm never going to write a memoir. And then a tragedy happened, and I found myself writing, not planning to write a book, but needing to write as therapy, because reading is how I've always processed the hard parts of my life. What happened was that my son died. My 25-year-old, very fit, healthy son was out running in a group, and he collapsed and died. And it turned out later that he had a form of heart condition that had no symptoms and was never diagnosed. I don't know if you remember the football player, Christian Eriksen, the Danish football player who fell down on the pitch. I remember that day very well because it was not that long after my son's death. And we were having dinner with some friends, and their son came in and said, Christian Eriksen's just fallen down on the pitch. And I knew immediately what it was. I knew. And I wasn't going to go in and look at it because I knew that would, seriously mess me up. But someone like him would have tests again and again and again, and that wasn't found. So it's extremely rare, but it's still common enough that in the UK, up to 12 or maybe more young people die every year from it. So my world was thrown completely into chaos. And one of the things people said to me in their first reaction was, I can't even begin to imagine what it's like to lose a child. And I remember thinking, well, nor can I. I can't take it in. And in some ways, this book is a way of trying to simply, it's, a great shock absorber, really. But it's also what I wanted to do when I realized that the notes I was writing to myself could one day become a book. I very much wanted it to be a book that would help other people who are grieving, not just necessarily for the loss of a child, or a spouse or a loved one, or a way of life, but also for the environment, for the world in which we live, which we can see and which is very apparent in your book. we are losing something enormous. And it's, again, like losing a child, almost too big to take in. It's just too big to see. And we're in the midst of it. So I wanted to somehow combine those two types of grief, or use those two types of grief to mirror one another. And because my son was an environmental activist, it felt somehow very appropriate that I should put those two things together and try to make sense of it in a way that could be useful to anyone who was reading it, whatever they were grieving for.
Can you, in a process that I can't even imagine as a parent, how do you begin a project like that? How do you write the first word? How do you decide, I'm going to write a book about this, or there is a book in this?
Well, I certainly didn't decide there was a book in what I was writing for the first 9 months or so, because what I was doing, I was processing my thoughts, such as they were. I was so shocked I could barely stand up. I spent a lot of time lying on the couch with my phone in my hand, putting notes into my phone. And every now and then I would send those notes to myself and put them in a folder on my computer and not read them again. And they amassed and amassed and amassed. And at some point, there did come a kind of turning point, and I know it was 9 months in, because it was very much, I had this metaphor in my head about, I was pregnant with him for 9 months, and at the moment of his death, there was it triggered almost a kind of reverse pregnancy. It was a weird metaphor, but it felt very true to me, and I've spoken to other mothers who felt the same thing, that it was a kind of unbirthing, a reverse birth process. So it was around that time I thought, well, I'm going to read those notes. And I read them through, and I thought, well, yeah, this could become a book, but it has to be a very particular kind of book that must be helpful to more than just me, more people than just myself. And I wanted to reflect a lot of who he was, because he was a very extraordinary young man, and he fitted into those 25 years of his life more than most people do in 50. And I think in some way his body knew it didn't have long, because there were all sorts of, there was a big premonition on my part that I was going to lose a child before he was even born. And he had certain intimations, I think, that made it very clear. He had the feeling he wasn't going to live a long life.
He also had this great spirit of defiance, of civil rebellion, and it feels like you have very much taken that baton, and that spirit is alive in this book. There's a fight going through this book. This is you standing up to the grief, and you trying to craft something, a diamond, with the heat of all this out of it.
Yes, well, the environmental concern began a long time ago for me, and it was mostly focused on climate, and I wrote those 2 climate thrillers. He was much more, we had a lot of conversations in that time, because he was studying zoology, and, he was a wildlife biologist who was very concerned with wildlife habitats and their loss, and the protection of endangered species, and he worked on a lot of sanctuaries where they took in these poor, abused animals that had been in cages in markets or had been sold as pets and then abandoned and couldn't survive in the wild. So we had an ongoing conversation, and when Extinction Rebellion began, he was involved immediately. I think he was like 23 when he was running their social media. He was pretty young to be doing what he was doing at that very pivotal time. And I was much more on the edges, and I founded with some fellow writers this group, Writers Rebel, because we wanted to do something to get more writers involved and concerned, because there was a wonderful book that came out in 2016 called The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh.
Yes.
And he was a huge influence on me, because he was saying in that book, there is a colossal failure of the literary imagination at a time when we need it more than ever. Why is nobody writing books about this? Now, I felt, yeah, he's right, but I really wanted him to be wrong. So that was part of my motivation. And it was my son, Raphael, who was already deep in Extinction Rebellion, who put us in touch with other people in the movement, and we founded this group, and it's been running ever since. And we also run something called the Rebel Library, which is an online collection of some of the best writing in all genres about the climate and ecological emergency, and it's also got a lot of nature writing in it. And so we worked sort of in tandem, never close together, but we were usually in different countries. I live in Denmark, he was living in the UK and all over the world a bit in that time, but we certainly we were focused on the same kind of thing. So when he died, I felt, of course, I was going to carry on once I could the work I'd been doing before, but a new energy came into it because I was doing it for both of us insofar as I could. I mean, I certainly wasn't the only one to be hugely influenced by him, because he was a very, very charismatic young man, and he made a big impact on that world in the time that he had. So I just wanted to honour that in the book, and then try to take it further in whatever way I could by trying to find some meaning in it.
I'm very interested in the differences between fiction and non-fiction in sorting out these things. It feels to me, and I could be wrong about this, but it feels to me like fiction slightly has the edge of non-fiction in terms of being able to process ethical dilemmas, the human condition, issues of morality. Did you find when your characters kind of voiced these concerns with living on the precipice and society on the precipice, did you find that fiction was very useful?
I don't know that I would task literature with utility.
Okay.
I think that's an outcome. It's complicated.
Yeah.
I think it maybe depends on the artwork itself. I think that if a work of art has an agenda, then it might be something other than a work of art. It can maybe be two things at the same time. I'm wary, though, of literature as a conveyor of ideology. I think that novels are fundamentally questions, and so, I think it was Yeats who said that the quarrel shouldn't be with the world, it should be with the self. And I do think that that's the quarrel of most art in some way. And inherently, if you are interrogating yourself, and if you're asking a question that is scary and where there's something at stake, and you are making yourself vulnerable by asking the question, then certainly the reader will be inspired maybe toward a certain type of thinking or a certain type of activism, but I'm not sure that it's a mode for conveying that type of thinking.
But you knew it was something you wanted to have in the alternatives. You knew that it was going to be a...
I didn't want to write this book.
Okay.
My partner is an environmental scientist, and so I live with this stuff all the time.
You're blaming him.
I could feel this novel coming, and I could tell that it would be a novel that contended with the moment that we're in, because of the central character Alwyn, and I knew that I would be writing about characters who are tied up in the existential ropes of the climate crisis. I think when I grew up, I thought that I want to be a writer, but if I had a second life, I'd love to do something in the earth sciences. I'd love to be a geographer, or I love the outdoors. You think you guys should quit? Fair enough. Point taken. But it's hard to be a romantic earth scientist anymore. You're dealing with degraded topography, with catastrophic climate change, with species extinction. It's really, really tough and I do think that there's a vocational kind of a romantic vocational aspect of wanting to work out in the weather, or to be able to look at a landscape and to want to understand how it came to be that way. What processes it's been through, what its story is, what kind of moves it might have in its back pocket for the future, what life it's accommodated. To be able to look at the landscape in that way, it's a sort of existential work. So it's very adjacent to me to being something like a philosopher, but maybe with more of a material interest. And I just knew that this sister, this woman existed, and she had big sister energy, and then it kind of dawned on me, they're all interested in their work, but most importantly, in relation to your question, I was scared because I know what it is to enter that terrain of talking about that work, of conveying what that work is, and my partner can meet somebody at a dinner party and within 30 seconds can be asked by a complete stranger, do you have hope?
Yeah.
And like, are we fucked? Like, and to the responsibility to deal with that question. Yes. I can see this calculation going on where you're trying to read the other person. How much time do they have? How much interest do they have? Do they have children? What kind of steps can I take? It's exhausting. And I think now it's not only people who work in the earth sciences who are dealing with that. There's many other, I don't mean to say it's just scientists, there are many jobs that spill in, but I think almost all jobs are spilling in some way, certainly all teaching jobs. Teaching has never been about the transference of information. It's always, that's been a minor aspect of it. The nuns go wild on that, but on the rote learning, but this, that's not what it's about. And so you are handling people's mental health, you're being a guardian of their ability to work in a group, to share their ideas, to engage in critical thinking, and all of that. In these days, you tend to be dealing with students who are frightened and who, for very, very good reason. And so you have an enormous responsibility. And so I was interested in writing a character like that, but also the people who love her. Because that's also, a role. I think writers are pretty awful to date, but I think climate scientists are worse.
We'll keep that amongst ourselves. Liz, it's a real fine balance, because in terms of getting people to change their lifestyles, to take this planetary crisis seriously, you can't scare them too much. So they just think, oh, there's no hope. And yet you can't make them feel that it's all being looked after by the likes of Alwyn and the scientists out there. How do we strike that? How do writers strike that balance in trying to appeal to readers?
Well, I think about this a lot, and it's something we discuss a lot in Writers Rebel, because, the people, when readers can smell an agenda a mile off, and they recoil from it quite rightly. So if you come into a novel with an agenda, you end up sounding didactic, and that's deeply off-putting. So I think what you said about having a question, posing it as a question, is really important. But I also think that, to go back to Amitav Ghosh, what he was saying, and one of the things he was saying was, no one's even glancingly referring to it. This has changed since 2016. A lot more writers are sort of noticing, with horror what's going on around them, and somehow, incorporating it, often quite mildly and gently, into their work. And I think that's a really good thing, because it does begin to shift the conversation. Because once something's in a book and, you've got book groups discussing things, that conversation opens up more and more and more. So I think stories of any kind are a fantastic vehicle. And I think there are a lot of climate scientists and people, working to try and restore our devastated nature, who are very aware that storytelling is the way to convince people, or to open people's eyes. So I think, as storytellers, it's part of our job to really calibrate the way we work so that it's accessible and readable and gets people simply thinking, not just about their own lives, because, you can recycle as much as you like. It's not going to, on the on the big scale, do anything much. But to think about the systems that are in place that perpetuate extractivism and, exacerbate the situation we're already in, because we're hearing, endlessly about the time running out, and yet we're taking more oil out of the ground than ever before.
Yeah, that's the scary thing, isn't it? The emissions are increasing, and the consumption is increasing, and it just feels like there's no handbrake on any of this. There's no even attempts to really temper it in any way.
Well, but the thing is, it can be done. One moment when I was writing this book out in Connemara, and there were all these fires all over the landscape, and my partner and I were out for a walk, and we were chatting to a guy down the road. We were like, "What's with the fires?" And he said, "Yeah, they're burning the heather and gorse and furze to so that from above the landscape looks like it's managed, so you can get a subsidy for managing the land." And that's just an example. I mean, yes, that's devastating to hear, but it's also like, there's so many easy pickings. Like, there are so many things that we need to change, but there's also daft things that we're doing that just, there's been so much inertia, which is to say the status quo, rather than really going back to questioning really every level of policy. There's so much work to be done, with farmers, with conversation, there's just so much work that is, I find that quite hopeful. Because, yeah, I do, because I think it's been so recent. I don't know what your experience is. I think it's so recent that people are having the conversations, and that people are moving along in their grief trajectory. This book has done really weirdly well in Australia, and I feel that it's because they're further along. They're ready. They've been talking about it for a long time, and I'm sure there are many other countries. It just happens to be that.
Well, they've literally seen their country on fire.
Yeah, repeatedly, and so. And you might think that that's kind of a depressing thing, to think that by more and more conversations happening, it means more and more people are contending with grief. But the last stage of grief when it comes to the climate crisis can't be acceptance, and it won't be. And so it's a different trajectory, and we can, we're building that as we go. And I do think that the idea of people waking up to it means, you reach a tipping point of awareness. People don't want to feel like they are going toward inevitably, toward a cliff's edge. And so I do think that the more people become aware, and the more the media allows for the narratives of what's taking place, but also to discuss the alternatives, to discuss, how you can reshape things, and what studies there are, giving room for actual, for experts rather than just people with a lot of platform, that type of thing. There's so much work also there to be done, because people want to read about it, but they not understandably don't really want to read about how many koalas died or how many people's homes got flooded out, because they don't know what to do with that. And there is so much work. So I think people, there's a collaboration there that needs to happen between what people are willing to expose themselves to and to learn, and what the media is willing to give time to.
Caoilinn said an interesting thing there, Liz, about the stages of grief, and that made me think about your book, because this is something that you speak about in your book too, and the idea of these different stages that you go through, not only with the loss of a loved one, but with the loss of an ecosystem or environment. This idea of aggression and then bargaining and all these things. Did that ping with you as well when she said that?
Yes. Well, when after he died, I read a lot of books about grief, and I read, about the different models of grief that people are familiar with, like the dual process model, which is about, there's you're spending part of the time deep in your grief, and another part of your time in sort of moving forward and living part, and you're oscillating between these two. But prior to that, the most commonly known model of grief in the West was the one that was written about by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with these famous 5 stages of grief, which was actually with her colleague David Kessler. And these were originally for people, not the grieving, They were designed to help people who were dying. And I think it's really important to remember that, because I think that model has since got a little bit, hijacked and subverted and rubbished as a model. But it is a useful thing to be aware of, that, there is the denial stage and then bargaining and anger and depression and acceptance. Those are the stages. But the climate scientist, Steve Running, he was the first to draw the analogy between personal grief and climate grief. And of course it fits very well, except, as you say, when it comes to acceptance, because you've got the denial, which is, is continuing in newer forms. Denial is kind of greenwash now, or it's 2050ism and all those things about kicking the can down the road, basically. And then bargaining, of course, that's 2050ism as well. We'll do it later. Or it's not that bad, or there's a techno fix for it. Then anger, well, I think I felt a lot of anger about it, but anger doesn't really take you anywhere. It gets you onto the streets and it gets you arrested, and that can be useful in its way. But then depression, there's that's where you don't want to get stuck. And I fear that there is a massive explosion in climate anxiety among young people, because that's where a lot of young people are stuck. They're aware of the cognitive dissonance, and they're aware they've had it and they want to get out of it, but the way out of it is, facing up to, the scale of what's happening, and that's very depressing. And then acceptance, well, we can't accept, we can acknowledge that it's happening. But I think, for me, there was quite a turning point when I read the work of David Kessler, who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and continued writing about grief and talking about grief after her death. And he came up with a 6th stage of grief, which had a huge effect on me. And he wrote a book called The 6th Stage of Grief, Finding Meaning. And for me, that was so important, because I just wanted some meaning. I wanted it to mean something. And he'd only come up with this stage after he had also lost his son, who died tragically after an overdose. And, he felt that everything he'd ever known or learned about grief was just, he didn't get it anymore. And so he somehow came to this feeling that meaning is the most important thing to look for. And I think that definitely can apply to the climate emergency, that if we look beyond, those 5 stages, or whatever we call them, phases, then there is a stage where we can find some kind of meaning in the life we have, in the time that's left to us, but also in, this notion of becoming good ancestors to the generations ahead of us. And that is enormously meaningful, I think, to look ahead with an understanding that, yes, we have been part of the problem, but we can also be part of eliminating or lessening the problem for the people who are going to be most impacted.
This might be a good time to invite Liz to read something for us. Would you do that? Just to give us a flavour of your book? I'm happy for you to choose whatever you'd like.
Yes, well, I think I'll read you 2 little pieces from the prologue. Today, every child is born into a rapidly vanishing Eden. As a wildlife biologist and environmental activist, Raphael felt this viscerally. He could have sunk into apathy or depression in the face of the ecological desecration he saw every day. Every time I write about an endangered species, it feels like I'm writing its obituary, he told me once. It grieved him, but it didn't deter him. His talent was to look for the tiny aperture at the heart of every crisis that lets the light in. When he found it, he did all he could to widen it, let in more light, help it spread. To some, collapse seems inevitable, he wrote. To others, ambitious systemic change is not only necessary, but offers an opportunity for hope. I tried to apply this to my own apocalypse. As I searched for new stories, rituals, knowledge, and physical practices to alleviate my devastation and to simply stay alive, Raphael and I began fresh conversations about the world. Weird sometimes, funny often, consoling always. And riding the ever-changing waves of grief, I learned to heed the instincts that the process of civilization has suppressed in our species, the instincts of the animal we are. In honouring our own creaturehood and attending to my intimations of the numinous, I discovered strength within the deepest pain. I'm not the same person I was before. After trauma, no one is. We hear about post-traumatic stress, but we hear less about post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic regeneration, and post-traumatic spiritual awakening. Yet I have felt all these things in my mind and in my blood, and I inhabit my skin differently. I'm less an I and more a we. And this doesn't make me feel small. Instead, it frames me as a cell that pulses within the living body of another vast organism that is vital to my own survival and the survival of all that it contains. My son's death will never make sense to me, but it's taught me that it's possible to find other kinds of meaning collectively and individually in the loss of what we love, and in finding them transform. Resilience is a seed that we all bear inside us. It germinates in emergencies. It sprouts whether we ask it to or not. It sets down roots in astonishing and unexpected ways, and if we notice it and tend to it, it blooms. I have seen it among others who are bereaved. We are sadder than we were, but we cherish life more because of all we owe it. We have learned that if we love the world again, it will love us back.
Caoilinn, you were in a car accident in Spain when you were writing this book. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about trying to get your head together, trying to heal, trying to write through the trauma of that?
Oh yeah, you had the NDE, the near-death experience in your book. It was a very lucky experience in the end. In that, it was kind of an inch in the difference. But in short, we had spent all of COVID converting a electric van, the first ever electric van that they made. So you had to charge it every 5 minutes into a camper van, and we kind of learning carpentry on YouTube, and it was great fun. But after things opened in COVID, we drove it to Spain and got hit by a truck on the motorway. So it was 100 kilometers an hour. We were stopped in the emergency lane, and it was my side that got hit. And I saw the truck was going to hit us, because with an electric car you can take off the eco mode and go really, accelerate really quickly. But I was insisting, no, let's just wait. He can see us if he's 300 meters away. Let's just wait. It's safer. And anyway, that turned out to be the wrong decision. But I did have the immediate sense of, this was the book I should have been writing were I to be hit by a truck. I just thought of the book and that it hadn't been finished, which is to say, it sounds like a kind of wild thing, like lady, get some perspective. But on the other hand, I have to admit that that's part of what it is to be an artist. You are trying to get to the core of what it is to have been alive and to be alive. And that's what I felt like I was working on. And so immediately afterwards, once it's a complicated, I maybe shouldn't. I'll start getting re-triggered and telling you way too many details. But once I realised that I would live, I immediately wanted to get writing, and then there was a battle of dealing with painkillers and all these medications that make you soporific. But I was so grateful to the novel, because if I had been 10% further along in the book, I would have lost the book. I know myself and I know my process, and I certainly would have lost it. So I just felt so lucky to have that, and to kind of have at a certain point in a book, the characters are completely real, and they have their own energy, and they actually sort of demand that you sit down and just and they bring the work. And at that point in the book, I was also in one of the play sections. So there's two play called Act 1 and Act 2. They're sort of halfway between a play and a screenplay, when the sisters come together, just because there's so much talk, and so really I didn't even have to be on the page as an author in interpreting things and interpolating things. They were really, moving things along, and the danger was that they, make me laugh, and laughing was not an option because there was a lot of damage to my ribs. So that was a tricky one. There are some lines that I'll never forget the pain after writing the line. but no, it was a very, very lucky experience in a way. But I suppose this is consequential of not having children, that wasn't my immediate thought about anyone else.
Do you want to give us a flavour?
Sure, yeah. Okay. I'll read from the opening of the book. So you're going to hear Aoilinn Flattery. And this is the galley of the book, so I'm curious now to see whether there's any changes.
Stained with sun cream from my reading it on a nude beach in Lithuania. That's another story. Well, yeah.
The air is mild for October. Nothing shivers, nothing smokes. A gentle westerly whistles at the panes of the lab windows like an unwelcome uncle, determined to raise the hairs on some young neck. 20 necks bend to observe the experiment. A perspex prism known as a squeeze box, the size of a narrow aquarium, is filled with thin layers of coloured sand. This is sort of meant to represent the squeeze box on the front. The ends of the box are movable, so that its contents can be compressed to demonstrate the effects of tectonic convergence. Thrusts, faults, folds, belts. Excuse me. Aoilinn presses a fist to her mouth to stifle a burp, and a few students snicker. Lo and behold, geologic processes for the puny human attention span. There's something very bodily about Aoilinn Flattery that the undergraduates find wildly amusing. Moments earlier, she'd used a shard of slate to scratch her inner elbow psoriasis, and a puff of dead skin particles danced visibly in the ventilation. She placed the shard back in its tray and, with her chalky fingers, lifted out a teeny tiny sanitised kidney stone for the undergraduate scrutiny. Moving this kidney stone involved a person's hospitalisation. Just imagine the force it would take to move a mountain. We're not talking about violent, sudden processes like an earthquake shouldering up a mountain range. No. These forces are so incremental and immense, so imperceivable and unstoppable. There's no halting their progress. They're underway right now as we stand here on the shifting foundations of this institute. The students scan their pals for clues as to how to feel. They have learned to take what levity they can from these light and flaky moments, as Aoilinn's lectures so far have been something of a shockwave. We're a wreck, she says. Ireland is one big crash site, where the ancient continents, Laurentia and Gondwana, collided like two humongous cruise liners, long before the nouveau riche were evolved to populate them. The wreckage cuts stupendously across this island, from Dingle in the west to Clogherhead Head in the east. The island was underwater back then, so that story didn't make itself known for millions of years. And here we stand, sifting through the evidence of that collision in our desk organisers, all of us above sea level, for another decade or two anyways. Several students begin to agitate in the pause that follows. It's hard to read the undergraduates, to know what's getting through, what with the scarves cobra'd around their mouths and their minimal eye contact. They all seem hungover or stoned or just returned from a silent monetary meditation retreat in Bali they spent their loans on. But they also seem deeply unnerved, and it's not paranoia. How information is delivered seems to be more consequential than the information itself, Aoilinn thinks. She is losing her strength to hand it over gently. but a teacherly muscle memory prompts her now, having pushed, to pull. Have any of ye seen it? She makes eye contact with each student in turn, in case, as first years, they need drawing out. Shauna, an exchange student with the gall of a parking enforcement officer, asks, "Is it here in Galway? Because car rental in this country is a joke." "It's not in the immediate vicinity, Shauna, but I saw the Rock of Gibraltar," Eric offers out of nowhere, a very tall student with asteroidal confidence. Alwyn hears the clock on the wall tick forward a cluster of seconds all in one go, like heart palpitations, harmless but horrible. "If you tell me you flew down to see the Rock of Gibraltar, Eric, when you haven't taken a bus to Dingle to ogle our own monumental bodies of rock." In the pause that follows, Eric takes a seat and runs his fingers through his gelled hair, leaving striations that seem almost infrastructural, as if water might collect in them. Alwyn is grateful when Fionnuala, not technically a mature student, but she has a lot of cop on, cuts in with something likely to be relevant. "I went to Edinburgh during the summer. For the festival," Geraldine clenches with envy. "Yeah," says Fionnuala, "but we took a day trip to Sicker Point." She glances at Alwyn. "You did not." Alwyn replaces a chunk of granite she'd been using as a stress ball back in the specimen tray, readying herself to shake Fionnuala's hand. Fionnuala smiles. Fionnuala, by the way, is in a wheelchair. "It was a little tricky to get out onto the rock, but it was worth it." Alwyn looks around the group. Does anyone know what historic expedition Fionnuala was honouring, trekking out to Sicker Point on Scotland's weather-battered coast when she could have stayed in Edinburgh town to watch shit-faced Shakespeare? Do you want to say, Fionnuala, what you saw there and who saw it first? Fionnuala acts a touch more flustered than she is. So James Hutton, I guess, back in the 1700s, he found these rock formations, these really crazy layered rocks, kind of like pastry, or maybe I just associate Scotland with pastry. Sedimentary rock, Alwyn gestures, like the strata of coloured sands in our squeeze box experiment. Exactly, yeah. And there were horizontal layers like that, and then vertical sections too, side by side or sort of on top of one another at right angles. And the vertical rocks and the horizontal formed in totally different ways in different time periods, and Hutton basically looked at them and instantly understood plate tectonics, or a theory that led to it. Or was it just that he knew that the centre of the earth was molten rock and that was how new land was made, instead of, like God making it? Fionnuala keeps glancing to Alwyn for confirmation. Because before that, she presses on, he could see erosion happening and couldn't understand how all land hadn't just washed away by the weather. How was there anything left? And the only explanation anyone knew for new land was God. But Hutton saw those rocks and he knew they were evidence that the earth was billions of years old instead of thousands, because the formations would have taken, a really, really long time. At Fionnuala's unsure expression, Alwyn nods with the restrained pride of a surgeon, confirming that they got it all, that the patient has plenty of life ahead. I'll leave it there.
You're a bit of an old ham, Hughes. You're quite the performer, and you must say.
Put it on my CV. Ham.
Liz, I have a very serious question for you. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I heard a rumour about you that you once wanted to marry a chimpanzee. Is this true?
Yes. Do you remember that? My friend Jo is in the audience. We were at school together. Do you remember that I used to say I wanted to marry, actually, I think it was a baboon.
A baboon?
I mean, we were really young, okay, we were like 5, and I was very into Jane Goodall. I still am. I mean, what an incredible woman. Maybe I was a bit older than 5, but anyway, I was obsessed with Jane Goodall and everything she did with the chimpanzees and the apes in the African jungle, and I didn't know really much I didn't know anything about sex, and I certainly didn't know what marriage was meant to look like, except that if you really liked something, you married it. So I just wanted to marry an ape. It seemed reasonable. And actually that, weirdly enough, made its way into a book I wrote called Ark Baby. which was my second novel.
It sounds completely logical when you put it like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Sure.
With the activism that you do, are you wary of doing work in the terrain that your son would have worked in specifically? Do you try and steer, protect that area in your mind, or do you mind if there's an overlap? Because obviously you have this interest in wildlife, but you also have skills and life and equipment as a writer, and so the writing, the rebel, what did you call the group?
Writers Rebel.
Writers Rebel, yeah.
Yeah, well, I would never actually, at this age, I might have done when I was younger, go and live in Costa Rica and study venomous snakes, which is one of the many very dangerous things he did. But I very much shared his fascination with creatures and still do, but I'm not a scientist like he was. I don't know about it on that level. But I talk to Raf quite often. I know he's dead and it might sound mad, but I bet there are a few people here who know exactly what I'm talking about.
Doesn't sound mad.
I just think he just wants me to do whatever I need to do to feel okay. And, I don't think he'd feel I was stepping on his toes in any way if I did decide to, go down that route a little bit more. So, yeah, I think anything's possible at the moment.
Okay, down to the serious business. What are your tips for aspiring writers, people who are thinking of taking the first steps into writing, or people who are maybe already a little bit down the road? What kind of particulars do you have in your toolkit that have helped you? Even just one or two things.
I have 3 words.
Okay.
Read, read, read.
Yeah.
And it's very, very simple because, if you want to write, you need to absorb enough of the writing of other people, and I mean across all genres. Be really, a bit of a reading slut, because ideas come from all sorts of, the styles come from all sorts of places. You pick up things you didn't expect if you read across a lot of genres. So I think that's very important. Notice what you read. Notice when you're moved by something. Notice when you're bored by something, or stimulated, or disagree, or find that something feels implausible. So just sort of be aware while you're reading, without losing the enjoyment of reading. It's not a task, but just sort of have a craftsperson-like approach to writing. I often compare writing a book, especially a novel, I think, to building a ship. You can almost see it in 3 dimensions. It's got certain things need to be in certain places in order for the wind to fill the sails and for the thing to move through the water and sail to where you want it to go. If it's leaking somewhere, or if there's something that's shoddily built, or if you can't get down the hatch because there isn't a staircase, whatever it is, then it's just not going to work as a vessel. So I have an almost, not even almost, I have a pretty workman-like approach, which isn't to say that inspiration isn't important. It's incredibly important. But I think the reading, particularly for me, reading newspapers, news articles. I follow what's going on in the world, and it's always inspiring to me, because one of the questions I use when I'm writing, and I often put it to creative writing students, was, okay, if there's a topic you want to sort of explore more, the question I ask is, what if? It's always what if, because I tend to like to look ahead in my fiction, set things, in the near future. So, I will take something that intrigues me, and in a book I wrote called The Rapture, it was actually methane on the surface of the seafloor, and the fact that global warming is heating up these vast quilts of methane, and they're rushing up to the surface. So that was one of the things that I asked myself, what if there was a big underwater event like there has been billions of years ago, that actually causes a kind of cataclysmic event. So it's that inquiry that, like you said, it's the question that novel asks. The novelist first has to ask herself that question, or a question, and that's what gives me the motor, that's what keeps me going. And the other piece of advice I'd say is don't give up too soon. Because I've come across so many really, really good writers who lose heart. You can't really afford to lose heart. It's actually one of those things you've just got to tough it out a bit. And I mean, I'm guilty of giving up. I've given up on quite a few books in my time.
It goes back to our original theme, but the climate crisis as well. We can't give up.
Yeah. Just do what you can, where you are with what you got.
Caoilinn's one of these really annoying people who writes one draft. Just want to say that.
Well, it means I'm absolutely awful to be around once it's like for 60%, 70% of the book.
Okay.
But once I get to the last third, like you'd be wanting to know who my drug dealer is, because I'm so ecstatic all the time, you know. Because
this is just your process. It's just how you like to do things.
It's the only way I know.
Yeah.
I really, really wish I had a different way of doing it. But for me, I write completely into the dark without a plan, and I just have to have a very strong sense that there is that's where my magnet is, and usually, I mean, a way of thinking about it is, does it feel like there's something at stake for you as a writer? I would never write something that I could pitch in an elevator, really. I would only want to write something that sounds terrible in an elevator and someone wants to escape, you know, because if it sounds good as a pitch, it's probably more like TV, not great TV either. And there needs to be a discovery. And so, you know, if you, at the end of a book, the benefit of writing into the dark, which is the way that I write, I'm not saying it's the only way to write. Whatever way you do it is valid. But for me, it's the only way I can. And the benefit is that you end up arriving at a place that you could never have set out to arrive at. You didn't have the skills, the foresight, the wisdom, the experience, you know, that you just couldn't have written that novel until you've written it. True of a short story as well, but I do write very slowly, and for me, when I have a block, it's usually because I've done something dishonest somewhere on the previous page or somewhere earlier. For example, I might have decided that a character is divorced, and I've come up with a reason why they divorced, and then that's not right. And I don't know, I just get this sick feeling I'm awful to be around, I'm, you know, having just a terrible time, I'm procrastinating all the time, I've 500 tabs open on my computer, and eventually someone will say something, or I'll see something, and I'll realize that that's why they divorced, you know, and so it might even be a minor character, but I have to unravel to that point, because everything has to hold true. And so it can be that you give a character a line of dialogue that's convenient for the scene, or it sounds good, or, you know, but ultimately that can stop something from becoming, because it's always trying to become itself, which sounds very woo-woo, but it is. And I would say that, like, in terms of how to encourage people who maybe write that way, is I would say don't show something to anyone until it's quite far along. Because I know that I can't show or even talk about work. You're protecting it. The more you talk about it, the more it's getting informed by the way people respond and the way you hear yourself articulate it. So for me, it's really important, and I really, you know, I value my agent who doesn't ask me what I'm working on until, you know, which can be very scary to, you know, especially when they find out that it's got 4 PhD women with a play in the middle of it. You know, bestseller, here I come. But that, yeah, so trusting yourself, but in trusting yourself also, you have to give it a lot of hours.
Yeah.
So reading and sitting at the desk and giving it a lot of hours. Most of those hours you won't be writing a word. You'll be pulling out your hair and giving yourself skin conditions, but that's part of the process.
And does that style kind of bring you down the odd sort of cul-de-sac, and you have to backtrack because it's so on instinct and it's so kind of following your gut? Do you find sometimes that you have to go on little excursions just to find out what's not down there? And
the only excursion would be something like, there's a couple of lectures in the novel, again, bestseller, But and for example, like one of the lectures changed, and that's a kind of dead end in a way. And it wasn't that it didn't seem like it was working. I was quite married to it, but the further along I went, it started to cause problems, and it wasn't until quite a while before I realised, okay, this needs to be something different. So I can't say that I go down a plot, a trajectory. But what you can do, which is probably terrifying to tell anyone who writes this way, you can be 2 years into a novel and discover that it's not a novel. So that can happen.
Okay. So you're not recommending it?
I do not recommend it. At the same time, I to my core believe in it, because I think that writing is about discovery and trying to brave up to something that you can't articulate, and so I do believe in it kind of philosophically, but then we all we justify our pathologies.
Here, pathology is a good word. Okay, let's open it up to you guys, and let's see some hands in the air for people who might have something to reflect on from this discussion, or a question. Gentleman here.
Yeah, it's on in the front, isn't
it? Thanks very much. Just to give you where I'm coming from, it's an observation and probably a question. I'm an oil and gas geologist, retired, undergoing an environmental conversion. That's why I like to describe it. I would have said, Liz, that I was a target of Extinction Rebellion. But what really impressed me about that organisation was how they used art and street theatre. That really, art, literature, music cuts out all the bullshit. It goes straight to the soul. And that's what your son and you are actually doing. It's really important. And I think...
Here.
I know you were saying, Caoilinn, that, you shouldn't have an agenda. But I think in a way, either consciously or unconsciously, through your... well, I suppose this is a question. Do you believe that consciously or unconsciously you're actually mocking and ridiculing the system where you see injustice?
I don't know. I don't consider myself a satirist, so here I'm writing about characters who are all contending with systemic change in one way or another. So, Alwyn with this deep time and the geologic processes that are rapidly changing, Nell with the commercialization of the academy, and she last year her course would be called The History of Stoicism, and now it's called Self-Help and Happiness. So and adjuncting and all of that kind of piecemeal work, the symptom of neoliberalism, and then Maeve, is navigating the food shortage crisis and post-Brexit and this food nationalism, and Rona is contending with the weakening democracy, and so they're not trying to change the world, but they're engaged in big issues one way or another. I do think that most jobs are, if you're interested in it, if you lean into the job that you're in, and I'm inevitably going to write about people that I'm interested in, but I'm sort of interested in everyone. I said once at an event that I wouldn't write about an accountant, and then I realised that one of the people in the audience was the accountant for the library, from the New York Public Library. I'm like, I want to write about an accountant now, that one. So I've been thinking about it ever since. So I try not to judge, and I also don't, so sometimes people can get angry at that because, say, there's one character who isn't necessarily morally admirable, and it's been true of my other books too. And some readers like to have an instruction manual for how to read the characters, which is, if that character behaves poorly, they're going to be met with comeuppance. or especially if it's a female character who behaves poorly, you're going to give her a trauma in the narrative so that we can deal with the fact she's behaving badly. Okay, you know, she has this in her past, and I find that, you know, really depressing. So I rather to allow them to exist and to watch their behaviour rather than judging it. The original part of your question has escaped me now. There was something else I wanted to say, but
I think it was a comment about Extinction Rebellion and the way they use the medium of art to
with something in the framing. It might come back to me, but I don't know if you wanted to respond as well to the...
Yeah, I think the messaging has always been really good, and there's been a playfulness about what they do that you know, in the heyday, which is sadly over now. It brought people onto the streets, and there was a wonderful sense of community, and there was a lot of art making and print making, where you could go along to workshops and make your own, you know, badges, and they really encouraged all that. And a lot of, you know, several of the founders, or those in the founding group, were artists, visual artists. So there was always this sense of playfulness, which you need because, you know, this is a deadly serious subject. But you can't be deadly serious about it all the time. And that's why I think satire is actually, that's probably the one genre where you can actually have an agenda. And it can be out there, really. I remember many years ago I wrote a novel about consumerism. And I just had quite a lot of fun with, you know, creating characters who wanted to buy certain things and couldn't stop. You know, if an offer came through the door, they had to buy it, and that was sort of fun because I knew the reader would come with me, because there are certain satirical targets they're easy targets, if you like.
Who else would like to put a hand up?
I've really enjoyed this session, and thank you for your honesty, and it's been wonderful. These go by so quickly. I just wanted to ask you a question, Caoilinn, about the writing process. You mentioned that you could spend a lot of time and not get a word out. So I was just interested, because I completely identify with that, and I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, please.
Not a lot of time and not get a word out. Now, there's, I suppose, two different things. Have you eventually gotten a word out?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I have. Yeah, but there's
because
you know,
it's like one word a month or something, is it?
But there's a lot of processing that can go on, and it can be the case that sometimes you're not ready to write something. That, like, I often think about, you know, for example, a short story as being some kind of constellation, and you might have 2 points in the constellation, or maybe now I'm talking about triangulation, but you're missing a third point, and you can't really know what that is. But for example, I knew I wanted to write this short story about a glaciologist. The story's called Creep, and I knew she was from Belfast, and she was in a conference in Andorra, and she was going to leave the conference. It has a lot of parallels. I think it was part of my pre-thinking about this book. But I wasn't, and I had the situation, I knew the character, I knew how she sounded, and I just couldn't get the first, you know, I couldn't get the tone right. I even knew where I had got it down to, she's in the conference and she's looking out at the mountains that are confectioned in snow. I had the lines, I had, you know, and I had her there, and I knew where she needed to go. But something was missing, and it was about, I think, 2 years later, where a little piece of reading resurfaced in my mind. I had actually read it, but it just had been buried too deep in my mind about how bats have been learning to breathe just once an hour, you know, in their hibernation state. But recently they've been having to breathe more frequently, and that brings your heart rate up. And so the hibernation is less deep, and it's having all sorts of consequences. And it was this lesser horseshoe bat detail that I needed, because there was, you know, and I didn't know whether bats were going to be relevant for the story, and they're not actually. They don't come back in. It's not like some neat thing. But there was something in her thinking about the bats in this moment. Maybe it was a stepping stone for her getting out of the situation. And until I had that third point, I couldn't write the piece. Now that's really hard to teach a writing workshop and say, go find your bat,
No, I completely get what you mean.
Yeah, and so if you're pushing something too soon, like, do trust yourself. The main thing is you have to match trusting yourself with time on the chair too, so if you can do something adjacent, work on something else. Reading also really helps. I find reading stuff that's really good, that sets a high bar. And I'm happy to read like bad writing after I've finished a book so I can feel smug. But while you're writing, you want to read like really good stuff that makes you feel terrible and loads of self-loathing, because you have to reach peak self-loathing to write, in my experience.
One last question. Come on, right by the sea. No, nothing? Okay.
There's one there.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not reading an awful lot at the moment, but I'm really enjoying audiobooks, and I loved the alternatives.
Amazing audiobook.
Thanks.
Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and I won't always listen to audiobooks if I don't like them. It's really well done. And hearing you read your own book, you have a beautiful reading voice too. But especially Maeve's scene with the dinner party, riotously fun.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a full cast, which is really, really fun. I still haven't listened to it, but I played Alwyn and read the stage directions in the play part, but I did go along when one of the other actors was, and I kind of picked them, and one of the other actors was in and listened in, and it's tough, because it's always going to be a different interpretation to how you wrote it, but I did trust that they were giving it a lot of care. I mean, I've had audiobooks, thankfully, for all my books, and this time I was like, how is this financially feasible, the amount of time that you're giving me, and the care that the director and the producer had given. It was like they were putting on a theatrical production on the West End, so I'm very grateful. I will listen to it. I just have to it's just hard to do. The Wild Laughter was narrated by Chris O'Dowd, and I really want to listen to it, but I just can't bring myself to. But one day I will listen to this, because I'm so curious. We also recorded the play script separately, so I was really worried about how that would sound when it comes together, but the director was convinced that she'd get a better take if we did it separately.
Caoilinn Hughes.
I was going to say, I believe that you nearly narrated this book.
Yes, I mean, I wanted to narrate the audio book myself because it's my story, and I felt I should do it. And then a very telling, interesting thing happened 4 days before I was due to record it. Out of the blue, I lost my voice. I simply couldn't speak. And I had to contact my publisher and say, I don't think I'm going to get my voice back in time. And it took a week, actually, to get my voice back. And it was very hoarse after that. And purely psychological. I think, revisiting this material was very difficult for me. I mean, I can read little bits from it, but I couldn't possibly read the whole book again. I mean, I never reread my books anyway, but this one I don't think I could bring myself to. So fortunately, they were able to bring somebody in at the last minute, and I think she did a good job in the time available. And strange things happen when, the mind is a strange thing, and the body, I think, does react. The body knows what's good for it and what isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Back to following our guts and following our instincts, these things. Caoilinn Hughes, Liz Jensen, Kilmore Quay, right by the sea. Thank you to all of you. And thank you to the weather.
Thank you to Hilary.